I'd like to give a special shout out to all my patrons, my Wildlings, Night's Watch, and Kingsguard. My Kingsguard include Brendan, Nick, Oscar, Stuart, Josephine, Ikaika, Amanda, RJ, Shad, Nicoletta, Ezra, Jennifer, Jeffrey, Sarah, Pat, Kevin, and Ryan. Thank you all so much. You're the best.
Welcome back to the Fantasy Network, everyone. My name is, of course, Jimmy Nuts, and today we're going to be reviewing The Steel Remains by Richard K. Morgan. This is book 1 in a land fit for heroes. This is a grimdark trilogy that, if you look up what should I read if I enjoy grimdark or Joe Abercrombie, this is usually at the top of the list, but not so discussed, at least here on BookTube that I see. The only other person I know that's kind of talked about this is Mark from Slowly Read, who's read like everything grimdark, and he's excellent over there on the Slowly Read's channel. You should go check that out. But I wanted to talk about this because a lot of people know about the Takeshi Kovacs and Altered Carbon, which was adapted to Netflix, and people like Richard K. Morgan for that. He bucks back against the system. He's very crude. He's very harsh and brutal. And some people don't know that he's written this fantasy series. And I think conceptually, this is one of the most interesting things I've ever read. It resonated with me and hooked me immediately just based on what was being sold to me in the story. It ended up bouncing between a 3-star and a 5-star the entire time. But there was a minimum level of investment just based on the story and at least one of the characters here in The Steel Remains. I may do a trilogy review at some point. I have continued. I'm actually in book 2 now, but I wanted to kind of give you an introduction to a land fit for heroes, because if you are tired of traditional fantasy tropes or you just need a break, this is a really good entry for that, as long as you can handle the harshness and the brutality that he brings, that Richard K. Morgan brings in The Steel Remains. Also, if you just want to see a different take on fantasy, this might be up your alley. Fans of Prince of Nothing by R. Scott Baker, I think that this has a lot of parallels, not like outright one-for-ones, but I can see the lore kind of meshing and being similar for things that I loved about the lore and the history of Prince of Nothing. So I think you could give this a check out. But let's talk about what this book is actually about and how I found it. So this is set in a sort of medieval, at least from what I gathered, fantasy world. And Joe Abercrombie has a quote on the front that says he doesn't so much twist tropes as much as take an axe to them. So even though it's set up kind of at first in this traditional fantasy aura or setting or whatever, it totally takes a left turn. The best way I've described it is that it is a grimdark fantasy if the fantasy setting that it's in had also had first contact with aliens. And I can't say much more than that because I don't want to give it away. And I'm not going to read the back of the book. I do that with some books. This is one of those ones where I think the back of the book actually gives away way too much. So I'm not going to actually cover any of that. And I would encourage you to not read the back of the book and just go into it with that. I think that's a pretty plain explanation. This is a place that war has like torn through the land. And we have a cast of characters that were affected by the war. There's an empire. There's like a league of kind of like free nations. And once the existential threats of like these lizard tyrant people were thrown back, the humans go back to doing what we do best, and that's bickering and fighting amongst one another. Our main POV, and there are 3 main POVs here, and it's told from a third-person limited perspective, so if you like to be switching around in third person, this is going to be up your alley. But Ringo Angel Eyes, who they call Gil most of the time, is our gay, jaded, badass war hero. Whenever they threw back the lizard tyrant things in the war, he was the one that kind of was leading the charge. And the 2 other POVs were also involved in the war, and they have intersected, but now they are far apart. So we're kind of seeing them post-war, right, and where they end up. I did mention that Gil is gay. In this society, that is not okay. They look down upon that. But here's the interesting part, is that Gil is actually the war hero. So they can't just throw him to the side. The sad thing about Gil and the tragic thing about Gil is that he's being revered and kind of the exception to the rule in this society that's trying to like hold a higher moral standard, right? That's ridiculous, right? But Gil is the exclusion to the term, but the people that he has had relationships with, the people that, see the world his way, and the people who are like him are being executed. They're being persecuted, but he gets a pass. That's a pretty weird perspective to be in, right? So immediately Gil is just a fabulous character. Everything just feels very organic with him. Like, I believe in the character. He also has a big bad sword. So for all my Berserk fans out there or Dark Souls fans, he has a big bad sword called Raven's Friend. One of the coolest names for a sword ever. And Gil's just not, going through a lot of the stress from a post-war thing, but he's also jaded because society looks at him as immoral, but he saved them. It gives me very much Tyrion vibes. If you're a big fan of Tyrion Lannister in A Song of Ice and Fire, I think Gil could be right up your alley as a character that you can latch upon. Out of the three POVs, and I'm going to talk about the other two, Gil is the most well-rounded, the most taken care of, and I think he's one of the most interesting characters I've read in fantasy. The Gallows Gap battle was where the legend of Gil kind of happened, and all of his his two other main companions, right? And another one of those happens to be Igar Dragonsbane, which is a sick name. He's part of the Majak, I believe is how it's pronounced, clan, and he has come to defend humanity and everything, and now he's back with his clan. Igar is, I would say, the pretty prototypical barbarian type. At least that's how I interpreted it. I thought of, like, you know, the Dothraki, among other things that I've seen in fantasy. And he's a fun character and he's a brute. But because Igar has went and he's been with, people outside of his clan, he's now his clan's head. But he's clashing with a lot of the traditions and the way of life for the Majak. And then him and a head shaman for the Majak do not get along at all. Among other things, too. There's like in-tribe fighting among those people. There's different tribes. It's really fascinating. And I like the fact that him being exposed to different cultures leads to a conflict and some turmoil within his people now post-war. I will say I generally love barbarian-type characters like Karsa Orlong, anything like that. Igar, for me, even though I really enjoy like the cultural differences, and I think that they're actually distinct enough to stand out on the page, which does a ton for world building, I found his POV to be the least interesting. And it's not so much that it's bad or anything like that, but maybe I've been reading too many barbarian type characters lately. But I think he is a good character. He just felt less interesting, especially compared to Gil. And then our third character is a female character that is kind of in that scholarly role, and I really, really like her. Her name is Archeth, and she is the last Cariath on the planet, or maybe it's Cariath. I think it's Cariath. But she's the last one on the planet, and she is now an advisor to the leader of the Empire, and his name is Jiharo Cameron II, and he's a despicable man. At least that's the impression that I got off the bat. And she's actually addicted to a hallucination called Kryn. And it kind of struck me as like, I don't know, it seems like an upper. So like somewhere across between DMT and meth or something. Like you can have hallucinations on it, but it also seems to get people to perform better. Archeth is stranded on the planet. Her people left. And this is kind of where you see like the alien race thing coming. And I'm going to let you figure out how that all happened, because I think in investigating the lore and the history behind how all this stuff has happened and how these people are here is the most interesting part of this book. So I won't say any more. But just know Archeth is not your prototypical human and did not originate on planet Earth or whatever the planet might be called. And I said she's the last Cariath and that she's not exactly humanoid, but the interesting thing about the Cariath is that they are humanoid in appearance, right? And they've lived on Earth for thousands and thousands of years, and they're primarily engineers. So they're very, very smart. They have advanced technology. Like there's a portion where she goes back to the place where her people built like a house, or maybe it was her house, and the floors are heated. So we're in like this really, kind of classical fantasy medieval setting, but her people have places in this world that have heated floors. I thought that was such a neat little tidbit, and it almost like crosses into sci fantasy. Again, twisting the tropes and the genre defining things. Richard K. Morgan's not afraid to like buck back against those and really push the limits. And I like genre benders quite a bit. They are black colored in skin, and they are also immortal unless if they are killed. Or at least I should say that they're immortal-like. I don't know if they're actually truly immortal, but they could live for a very long time. Reminds me of the Scythe from Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. They can be killed by conventional means, though. So Archeth has an entire backstory of not being humanoid, right? Being humanoid-like. But it's a totally different race, and it feels like it, which I think Morgan does an excellent job of. And not to get too spoiler, but I will say there are other ancient races. There's a religion and Skykeeper, all these crazy things. So if you're a fan of science fiction and fantasy, I mean, there's a lot of cross here. I do think this is primarily fantasy, though. I mean, don't get it twisted. But I could see someone saying, hey, it's grim sci-fantasy type things. But there's just a lot of different races, and I'm a big fan of that in my fantasy. And these books are not very long. The Steel Remains is like 300-400 pages, and the other ones I don't think ever top out above 600 pages. So they're quick reads for the most part for being an epic trilogy, right? So a lot of time is given to kind of exposition-y, telling us about the backstory and whatnot. And I like that here. So whenever I told you it bounced between a 3 and a 5, but always had like a standard throughout the entire book, this is what I'm talking about. The ancient races, the unknowing if there were races before the races that we know that existed, the history and the lore, it's just so rich. And this is where also Prince of Nothing does a lot of this stuff with manipulating history, but also not knowing what came before. And that is so much up my alley. I wish there was more fantasy that pushed into that. I have noticed that I am really more into, when it comes to like world building and stuff and setting up a story, I'm more interested in the history of it because I find history in our world to be really fascinating. So that is why I'm so like in love, even though I'm conflicted on this book, because I'll talk about things I didn't enjoy soon. But it's just the premise and the concepts and the history and lore are awesome. You don't see them a lot, and Richard K. Morgan does a very good job of setting it up. And now I want to get into like more so what I didn't like about it. Now this is not a negative, but I have to tell you, yes, this is grimdark. There is and this again, I don't mind this stuff, but I know that there's a lot of people who watch this channel who want to get book recommendations. So I'm putting this out there as just this is involved in the story if you're not into that. It is super duper graphic. Has extraordinarily foul language. There are gruesome sex scenes as well as combat. I mean, this is grimdark. There's a lot of really heavy, mature themes, and it's brutal and it's bleak. But with that said, if you can handle those things as long as there's a glimmer of hope, like I find Gil to be such a tragic character. Like society outcasting, people like him, but he gets the pass and has that survivor's complex and he's trying to find a place in the world now and he hates the empire that he had to help defend. It's crazy good. But I do feel like there's a sense of charm to this book. And I think one of the quotes on the front cover for book 2 is like, it has a heart of gold. And it's a really weird thing to say about a book that is this disgusting at points, if I'm being honest. But it does. It has a heart of gold. And there's a sense of hope and joy. And as these 3 friends, maybe not friends, but comrades, right? Legends in the Gallows Gap, kind of be able to converge and come back together. There's something about that I really, really enjoyed. But I have to tell you that it is super duper graphic. And now for what I didn't like. So one of the things that Richard K. Morgan does is in the middle of like a chapter or a paragraph, he will just divulge into the person thinking back into a flashback with no like real break points, right? Like there's no like, oh, this is a flashback. So like you'll be listening to the person's inner monologue and you'll be like, oh, they're not talking about what's happening now. They're talking about what happened like 20 years ago. So you have to pay like a lot of attention and that's okay. But I am not, I'm not a big fan of flashbacks as is. And then 2, just like naturally flowing into it, it's weird. It's a style choice. I'm not saying it's wrong or it's bad. I don't personally like flashbacks, and then the way that it's done in this book is not my favorite either. But that's like a personal bias thing, so you might get a lot of different mileage with that. With this book being so like brutal and harsh, Richard K. Morgan's prose is exactly what it needs to be for this story and for the style of story he's telling. Okay, so again, this is not saying that it's wrong or it's bad. Sometimes it gets so close and it bucks up against the edge of being like edgelordy or cringy that I'm like, oh, don't go there. And he never quite got there, so that's a compliment. But there are times where the harshness of a sentence or even just the way that he writes, it's brutal writing. It just didn't resonate with me as much. Like it almost felt jarring, but it's intentionally jarring, if that makes any sense. And I think that there are some really distinct points in the plot that if it were not stated just the way that he stated it, it would not fit the character of the story, like the overall narrative feel and tone. So it's weird. I'm basically saying Richard K. Morgan has a very distinct style, and I think he's so good at staying consistent with it, but that style is hit and miss with me at different points in the book. But it's not because it changes vastly, it's just because of my personal taste. So take that for what it is. And then the other big thing is, honestly, I felt like the end, and I would love to hear other people's opinions on this, I felt like the end never got my pulse picking up. Like I don't know. I was never sold on the stakes that were being brought to me. Like I was fascinated for watching it and seeing what would happen, but I never felt invested in the ending. And I did feel like the ending kind of came up kind of quickly. Like it's like this big event and we're just kind of told what's going to happen and then it happens and it's over. And I don't know. It kind of felt rushed to me in some ways. And I wish the book was a little bit longer. How about that? I actually wish the book was longer. I think it was like 400 pages. I wouldn't have minded this being like, especially with all the history and lore, like 600-700 pages. But the ending kind of came up, it happened, and that was that. And now I've started book 2, and I still feel that way. I think I'm liking book 2 more so far, by the way, so that's a good thing. And there is enough here to be interested in and have enough mystery that I want to continue on. And also, I just think Gil's an awesome character. I love how on the nose some of the clashing and destruction of fantasy tropes happens here, and I know some people roll their eyes at that, but I enjoy that. I enjoy all different types of stories, and I think there's like a part of the thing where Gil's having a conversation and someone calls him like, you were a farm boy to a legend. And he's like, a farm boy? Really? That's my story? Like, get out of here. I'm not a farm boy. And I don't know. I just love that because we all know that trope. And Richard K. Morgan is just like kind of like a big middle finger to that. I don't know. I got a chuckle out of it. So yeah, this book, The Steel Remains by Richard K. Morgan, is a wild, wild book. Again, it's teetered back and forth between a 3 and 5 star. It's settled somewhere in between there for me. But the best thing is that it was enough to want me to continue on because the history and the setting and the lore and Gil are just awesome. Archeth is also really, really good. The thing about Archeth, though, is I love her POV because she's the engineer and everything, which makes sense. We get a lot more of the advanced tech or the history and what happened in the war and how it's maneuvered. And she's politicking in the Empire. I like politics. Except if you take all those things away from her as a character, being the last one of her race on the planet, is not as interesting as I thought it would be. But I'm interested in the plot overall and to see where it goes and what happens with all these races that there's enough questions to be answered that I want to continue on. However, the stakes that were sold to me here in book 1, especially at the end, I never felt were realized and I never felt were true. So it's a bit of a mixed reaction. But as you can tell, like I have a lot of thoughts about this, and I think after I finish the trilogy, maybe I will do something with Mark from Slowly Read if you'd like to do that. And maybe at the end of the trilogy, I'll do a full review for the trilogy to tell you where I ended up, because obviously I'm giving the story merit to be continued because of the mystery. So that would mean if we get another dud ending in book 2 or book 3, that could be enough to put me off. So it's interesting. I don't know. I feel like I've kind of gushed a little bit about this book, but I am mixed on it. And I don't know if Richard K. Morgan's writing is up my alley, but I think there is absolutely an audience for it, and you should give it a try if this at all sounds interesting to you. And I do think Richard K. Morgan's a very strong writer. It's just a preference. Thanks for checking out this review. If you liked it, hit like. If you disliked it, hit dislike. If you loved it, think about subscribing to see more grimdark, fantasy, podcasts, all kind of bookish stuff here happening on the Fantasy Network. I even got into manga recently, which I really like. I have a Patreon down in the description. It's optional, but always appreciated. And until I see you next time, be good, be safe, and remember to always keep turning the page.